Well, I want to welcome everybody here this afternoon, and I am so excited about our guest on our program, our video today. And we are going to be discussing the book Moving On, Surviving the Grief of Forced Termination. I want to first make some introductions. I am Dr. Matthew Tanner of Wounded Leadership and also co-founder of Pastors Compass, and which is an area of chat and community for pastors who have been hurt by the ministry. Steve and I are both survivors of this. Like pastors say, fought the battle, got the T-shirt. And so I'm just excited to have Deanna here. Stephen, tell us quickly about yourself and who are you?
Yeah, so I'm Stephen Boster. I don't have a doctor in front of my name, so I'm not Dr. Boster, kind of a thing, even though it sounds kind of cool. But I have a ministry called Servants by Design. And if anyone's ever done the men's fraternity, that third year where you have the profile, it's a communication personality profile, and that's what we do. It's based upon the process communication model, but we have the exclusive worldwide spiritual rights to do this for specifically for churches and Christian non-for-profits. And it is a fabulous tool just to help people really discover more about themselves and make you very self-aware, but also how to connect with others and deepen your relationship with God.
Man, that's awesome, Stephen. That sounds really good. Your spiel's so much better than mine.
I've said it a lot more.
You have. Well, guys, the reason that we're here is to introduce you to Deanna Harrison, the Executive Director of Pastors Hope Network. And Deanna, introduce us to you, and then tell us what led you to write Moving On.
Well, thank you, Matthew and Stephen. I'm Deanna Harrison. 15 years ago, my husband, who had pastored for over 30 years at that time, and we had been at a specific church for 7 years at that time, he experienced a coup led by a very disgruntled staff person. And from the time we knew something was wrong till the time we had to leave was 12 days. And so it was brutal. So we actually eventually moved back to our home state, lived with my father-in-law. This was back in 2009 when no one was hiring. It was the big recession due to the mortgage crisis.
Yeah.
Eventually we did land jobs in the nonprofit world, and we relocated and literally began rebuilding our lives. Mm-hmm. And reinventing, figuring out who are we. Life looked very different than anything we had ever known in all of our married life. And it was, I guess, about 5 years after the event of having to leave our church ministry that the Lord just put on my heart that I needed to write this down. Mm-hmm. I needed to somehow, and I did not know what it was going to be. In fact, the first time I attempted to, it was too painful. So I set it aside. But later the Lord prompted me again, you need to write this down. So I wrote it not knowing if I was going to do anything with it. For all I knew, it was just going to be therapy for me. After I wrote it, I gave the manuscript to my husband and I said, read this. And if you don't want me to do anything with it, I won't. I do not want to cause you any more pain than you have already experienced. And he read it and he just said, we need to publish this. Wow. So we did. Just all I did was put it out on Amazon, and I talked about it on social media. And the response I got from pastors and their spouses who read the book, that's what God used to call me to start Pastors Hope Network, which is an organization that works specifically with pastors who lose their ministry position and their families.
So yeah, I'm gonna put that website on the screen, and for those, it's just www.pastorshopenetwork.org. So PASTORSHOPENETWORK.org. There you go.
Good job.
For those who may be just listening to this, that I don't want to get that out there.
Well, and I have personally sent people to Pastors Hope Network, and I just want to speak about you guys because you have so many areas that you can help the pastor and the wives and the families walk through something like this, because it really is such a multifaceted event. There's not just one area of healing that takes place. So wasn't in my prepared questions, but what how do you start? I mean, how do you tell the pastors, just how do you start this process?
Well, when they reach out to us, we then set up a time to visit with them through Zoom, something like this. And we just listen to however much of their story they want to share. We are very aware that some pastors have to sign a non-disclosure and they can't share anything. Mm-hmm. But we are a safe space, and most pastors do just need somebody to talk to. Mm-hmm. We have a director of pastoral care, Dr. David Higgle, who meets with our clients. And then after listening to their stories, he connects them to the resources that we have that will best fit what they need. And sometimes we'll have a client say, I need this right now. And then months later, that client will say, okay, now I'm ready for this. So we're there for the long haul. Whatever they need, however we can help. We offer very practical resources. We don't offer financial assistance. We offer financial guidance. So there is a difference there. But we offer very practical resources to help the pastor and the entire family as they navigate a very difficult situation.
Absolutely. So let's dive in. I want to dive into the book. And when I was sitting there reading it, like I said, on a Saturday morning, or the family had gotten up. I had my coffee. I picked up the book and forgot about my coffee. But right in the preface, most people skip over the preface and the introductions. I'm a nerd. I read every word. I admit it. I dove into the preface, and you bullet pointed these what I call the permissions, or permissions you ask the reader to give themselves. Why did you start there?
I think I wanted to give the reader a heads up of what was coming.
Guess what?
Yeah, because grief is very, very messy. And I don't want somebody comparing themselves to somebody else, because the grief journey is very unique. No two journeys are identical. Grief is messy in that you think you've made a lot of progress, and all of a sudden you take multiple steps backwards. As I mentioned in the book, I use what I call elements of grief. It's Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's. She calls it stages of grief. But in my mind, a stage indicates, okay, I've completed stage 1. Now I go on to stage 2. Grief is not like that at all. All the stages mix together. It's just a messy, non-linear event. And
when you wrote that in the book, I was like, exactly. It's not stages. It's I loved that you used the word elements, because you even say you went backwards and forwards, and you said 2 step. How'd you put it? 2 steps forward, 1 step back, and sometimes 1 step forward, 2 steps back. And and I so appreciated that. So I think it was a sense of, yep, heads up, here we go.
Yeah, right. And also I wanted the reader, if they were married, to realize that their spouse may have a very different grief journey, and that is okay. You need to allow each other to experience grief, however that grief evolves for you. Yeah. So it was mainly a heads up. Here it comes.
I'm ready to start a petition that we just forever change that whole system from stages to elements.
Yes.
Let's tag that and make that part of the vernacular, because it's so true. And you talk about grief being messy. How do you help people give themselves permission to just to just be messy, because pastors, families, wives, we know the whole fishbowl mentality. Everybody looking at us. We're not allowed to be messy. We're not allowed to play that out. Now here we find ourselves, thrown out of the fishbowl onto the carpet, if you will.
Right.
How do you give them advice to be, it's okay for this process to look a little messy?
Well, you're not going to actually get through grief until you're honest about what you're experiencing. And if we continue to use spiritual language, or if we say, that I really was hurt by that event. Well, guess what? There's probably a lot more than just hurt. You were betrayed, and probably, I'm not going to say your grief journey. My grief journey, anger was the biggest thing I had to deal with. And it took, well, I won't say it took means I actually conquered it. I'll say this, 15 years later, there are triggers that will make that anger come back to the surface. And I have to have a long conversation with the Lord about it and continue to work on it. So I don't want to discourage your listeners of, guess what? You're going to be doing this for the rest of your life. But in some ways, grief is that way. You don't get over it. You have to learn a new way to live. And until you're really, really honest with the Lord, he really can't start the healing process. You have to acknowledge if you hate somebody, tell God you hate that person. It's not like God doesn't know. You're not going to surprise him.
Right. They're going,
right. Yeah. Exactly.
Well, I do want to preface, in the preface, you do say this, you say, but recovery is not the goal. The goal is to move on and live victoriously with grief as part of life. So then you go, so allow me, if you will, to refer to elements of grief rather than stages.
And by the way, when I read that, I was initially angry. I'm just going to be honest with you. I'm like, recovery is not the goal. That's what everybody teaches you. But as I've, gone through my research, stuff in my wheelhouse, I realized that it really is a lifelong process.
It is. And you don't want to wait until at the end of your life and you say, okay, now I've recovered. Well, in all that length of time, you haven't been living victoriously through it all. So the goal really is to be able to live victoriously simultaneously while dealing with all the different elements of grief.
And you mentioned something about triggers, and in my research or in my work, I coined a phrase, post-traumatic spiritual stress disorder. And it really is about, out of the blue, you get a certain text or a certain name is overheard, and all of that floods back. So how do you help people manage those things in the moment, and then ongoing care as far as where the triggers don't destroy you or don't shut you down like they used to?
Right. Well, it's a process, and it's a process best dealt with, I think, with a professional counselor who can give you the tools you need. I wish to goodness I had counseling 15 years ago. I don't think my own grief journey would have been as difficult as it was, but as you know, counseling is expensive. And when you've lost your job, saying, okay, I'm going to spend this much money for 1 hour to talk to somebody, it's hard to talk yourself into it. Nevertheless, it is extremely important to find a trained person who can help you work through all that you're going through, help you process it. And I will say there are lots of counselors out there who work on a sliding scale. There are some who take insurance. If you just keep looking and searching, I think it's possible to find somebody who will work with you that you can afford. And it's just really important to have someone to help you process what's happened instead of just having yourself or your spouse to process it.
Absolutely. And I want to go back on something you said a second ago. So we're going to go from the preface to the epilogue.
Okay.
Let's go to the bookends, and then we'll dive into the middle.
Okay.
because you said something about never, or I think Stephen quoted, it's this idea of expecting to recover fully, take that off of the plate. And that's so hard to do because we think that's the goal, but this never stops becoming a part of you or stops being a part of you.
Right.
So how do you find joy? How do you find purpose? How do you find peace in the midst of this process of recovery that you've now told your readers, by the way, is going to take the rest of your life?
Sorry about that. Well, in the initial months and even years, I had to just believe that his word is true and that he was going to work all things for good. I could not for the life of me see how what we were going through could ever be worked out for his good. I could not see it. I had to just trust that at some point he was going to work it for good. I've now 15 years out, I can look back and say, oh, okay. And so part of that joy initially is just belief. Say, okay, God, you are going to work this for good. I'm taking it by faith and just literally taking one day at a time, putting one foot in front of the other. I had an Old Testament professor in college who would say, knowing God's will is looking backwards and saying, oh, so that's what you were doing. And I think that really is true. If we know what God's doing as we move forward, it doesn't take any faith. Faith is taking those steps, not knowing what he's going to do. But then now, years down the road, time does help in many ways. And now I can honestly say, God has given me the honor of seeing how he is using all of our pain. And what I do now in my day-to-day work is such an honor, and it is God redeeming all of our pain. And so, but it takes time. And if one of your listeners is just lost their job, man, you just don't see it. And that's okay. It really is. That's very normal.